Hello, this is my first video blog, and until now I've been writing about mixing because I thought it would be a great idea to write about some of the things that are happening behind the scene in a film mix, because it's not something that a lot of people get access to. This time I decided to move a bit differently and show you exactly how I mix something in surround. Of course, you won't be able to hear it in surround, unfortunately, because most of the works would be uploaded on a video, and you would just have access to the stereo mix on it. But it's still fair enough to get an idea of the philosophies and the thought processes that happen behind doing a mix in surround. For this particular project, I've managed to get a track from one of my most favorite bands called Thaikkudam Bridge. They're a band based in Kerala, India, and this is a song called Chathe from the newest album Navrasam. In fact, the lead singer Govind was very, very, very kind enough to offer this to me as tracks and allow me to share it with all of you to show how a mix happens in surround. And in fact, you should check out their album on some of the songs on YouTube. That being said, it's always good to see how I receive the tracks. So these are the tracks that I've received. So if you look, I have the percussions, I have the bass, the distortion guitars, the acoustic guitars, some processed guitars, some pianos, some pads, some processed vocals. There's some chorus, the lead voice, and some additional effects down here. Now, the first thing that I do when I receive tracks is I would prefer to group them the way I see fit. So usually it's percussions followed by bass, followed by guitars or strings or instruments, followed by the chorus and the vocals in no particular order. Honestly speaking, one of the reasons that's probably come in this particular order is because of the way I import tracks. It would be alphabetical. Because most of the people kind of name the vocal tracks as Vox, it ends up being at the far end down. But obviously, it's also one of the most important things in a song. Now, if you look at the way that I've set up my session, you can see I've color-coded every track and all the clips on the track to the same color. It's very important for me to do that because just by one look, I know what clip I'm looking at. Does it belong to the percussion? Does it belong to the guitars? Does it belong to the vocals? It's very easy for me to do that. Now, the second most important thing for me to do that is if there's a change, let's say, for example, at this point over here, and let's say there's an overdub or there's a replacement of a track, instantly I can see that's a different color than the one that's already there in that track. That helps me identify if there's a change or if there's something else that's been done on that particular track. And, if you work with a control surface like the Avid S6, in fact, you can see all of these scroll down right on your screen on the M40 version of it. It is very important for me to tell you, first off, that there are different philosophies of mixing when it comes to mixing with video and mixing without video. When you mix without video, you are creating a world that is non-existent, right? That you have to imagine the visuals, and when you start imagining the visuals, it's different for every person. When you have a visual reference, everyone's reference is hooked onto that one thing on screen. The screen is actually telling you the story. Sound has to be invisible and help support that story. One of the main points in that is most of the times, I would say around 80-90% of the times, a surround mix of a song with reference to a visual is going to be different than the stereo version of the same song. I try and hear the stereo version of the song on a headphone because that's something that gives me the closest representation of the space, and I try to imagine how it is. What do they place in front? What do they have in the back? What is the soundscape that they've created? And I try and replicate that in a surround world. So I would have two main goals in this. One is to try and achieve the space that they have, and the second one is also to maintain the story that is being said on screen. When you don't have an on-screen character or there's no on-screen story that's being said, for me, it's not very easy to mix because my mind has to work on an overload, and the kinds of rides that you will see, the kind of EQs, the kind of changes that you would see is actually something that's very different. there are reasons for that. There are certain movements that you would not have done if you were not mixing to video. So like I said, this is a track called Chathe, which means dead or I died. Now, there are quite a few things that are very important when it comes to this track and when it comes to my interpretation of the track. It has a lot of cultural references to certain rituals that happen in a community or in a state after death. B, it has a lot of social implications. So my interpretation of the whole song is a man not knowing if he's dead or whether he's alive, he's still alone. And there comes a point where his soul tears away from him. And how do you know if the person that you're looking at is alive or the person who is looking is alive? So what is life? It's got a lot of complex interpretations that you can take into consideration when doing this song, which I felt is also very, very interesting because it offers a lot of creative space to try and experiment a lot of things. I'll also show you some of the techniques that I used in trying to achieve that. One thing to be understood is I'm running Pro Tools version 12, and one of the interesting things in this version is the fact that if you go to the I/O setups on the bus section, you can see I have a main 7.1 bus. I can actually map that to a stereo output. Now, because you're going to hear this as a stereo mix, I'm working on an HD native with an HD Omni over here, and I'm monitoring to my headphones. Now, this may not be a completely perfect surround mix, but the whole idea behind this mix is to show you the concepts and the philosophies involved in a surround mix. I've also gone one step ahead and added some stuff in Dolby Atmos because, again, that is a section where people have not seen what happens in a mix stage or how it is actually done. There's only written literature about this, and I'll try and show you some stuff in that, although it's not very complex, as the main intention of this was not to do Atmos. But then it's also interesting to show some things that you can achieve on Atmos. All my outputs and all my routings are going to stay in 7.1. It is just my monitoring part that will be stereo, which is a huge benefit for me. So let me start off the Atmos Monitor app. And as you can see, I've just used two objects. And this is the Atmos Monitor app that you're seeing here. All of these little yellow rings and these yellow circles that you see are objects. Now, if you read my earlier blogs, you would know that Atmos is basically split into beds and objects. This one represents the beds and this one represents the objects. What is very interesting in this is now I've set this up as a 9.1 setup here, but we're using the local renderer, which again I'll talk about in a minute. These 9.1 outputs, rather than going to 9.1 physical speakers, would actually come back into Pro Tools, which I can mix down into stereo so that you can actually hear it when the video is out. You can have different modes of listening to Dolby Atmos. When you're playing back, if I simply press the letter D on my keyboard, you can see it cycles between Atmos 7.1 and 5.1. And you can do that in real time as you play back. What that does is basically it takes your mix and it does a down mix into 7.1 and a down mix into 5.1. Again, if you read some of my earlier references of demystifying Dolby Atmos, you will understand why the downmix of Atmos makes a huge difference compared to having something that you cannot achieve using a conventional panel. But we'll skip that for now, when you can actually have a better read on my blog at that point of time. Coming back to the session, I'll play you a bit of the session just to give you a feel of the kind of song that we're looking at, and as we build the whole mix towards the end, so you can see how everything kind of fits into each other. So this is how the song kind of looks like, and if you look at the video, you would probably get a feel of what I am trying to achieve over here.
കണ്ടാരങ്കാവേൽ ചേരുന്നേ കണ്ണീരിക്കൊണ്ടേ പൊള്ളും മുന്നേ കരിന്തിരി കണ്ടേ നോവിൻ വായ്ത്താരി കേട്ടേ ഉൾക്കൈയിൽ കാലൻ വായ്ക്കരിതന്നേ ചൊല്ലുന്നേ ഞാൻ പണ്ടേ ഛത്തേ
Right. So the song actually takes off into a different color from there, which we'll come to in a minute. Let's just have a look at the rhythm section and what I've done with that. These songs were not tracked by me; they were tracked by the engineers of Thaikkudam Bridge, who is Amith, Rajan, and Hemanth. They have a fantastic drummer named Anish. All of this comes in directly from them. They have a mix of directly recorded and programmed drums within this. So these are some of the things that I've done. So if I solo the drums right now, this is how it sounds like after all of the levels and things that I've done sound like. Now, it may seem like the kick is over compressed, but that had a purpose to it. One of the reasons was that I didn't want the kick to open up a lot because there were a lot of little things that happened throughout the song and the visual, which I wanted to give more importance to. The second thing is I wanted the kick to give a little more space to the bass, and one of the things I did, like most engineers would do, is to have a sidechain send in from the kick into a compressor onto the bass. Over here you can see there's a snare top and the snare bottom. Because it's a snare bottom, I've put in a phase invert for that so that it aligns with the mic on top. Now, what is very important to understand in this is how are they pan in a two-dimensional space, like in surround. It's very important because when I started mixing for surround, there was a big no against panning percussion into surround. They would by default be piled up on left, right, and everything would be left, right, left, right, left, right. Now, my philosophy of mixing in surround is, if you look at the panner, or if you look at the space here, you actually have 3 speakers in front on your stage, followed by a set of array speakers for your sides, and again as another set of speakers for your back surrounds. If we start panning everything left, right, left, right, left, right, we're actually missing out this whole chunk over here, the center speaker. Now, what we would try to achieve is, if I pan this one to the left and this one to the right, I'm trying to create the center using phantom center. And the moment the voice hits that center, you would feel a disconnect between the way the voice sits in and the way the entire mix would sit in, because a center speaker can hook you right then and there, right? It's got a very central hook, and it's got a very particular tone that it would impart from that one single source. So when you start mixing everything as a quad or as just left, right, and just keep that space in the center for the voice, for me, in my philosophy, I've never felt comfortable doing that. But there are no rights and wrongs in mixing. It's all about what sounds good at the end. My kicks, they've been sent to the center. There's again a set of another processed kicks, which are like double tempo kicks, pretty much like this. And it's layered with another one right here. There's also snares, rise snares, and so one of the things that I've done with the snares is I've kept the top snare as it is, and I've given a little bit of divergence to the bottom snare. Now, if you've been reading my blogs, you would understand that I absolutely do not like divergence. But the reason I decided to put that here is, when you look at it from a drummer perspective, if you plan to look at the snare from the point of view of a drummer, that's probably his central portion. I think he spends most of his energy playing on the snare. I mean, of course, having a double kick like this makes things a little bit more difficult, but then this particular thing gives more energy. So I wanted to spread that out in the mix a bit, on the stage a bit. For the hi-hats, again, nothing very special. So there are some EQs that I had put in, followed by a pan man that opens up in a very particular section in the song where there's a lot of energy and a lot of changes that happen visually also. And there are some programmed toms over here. Again, for the toms, what I've done is I've pulled it a bit back because it kind of gives you a more filled up space for the toms, that can surround you a bit better. When you place this whole drum in the space of the mix, it would be that the drums would surround you. So, like I said, there are 2 approaches to a mix. You can have it from the band's perspective, you can have it from the audience perspective. For me, it depends. Like I prefer to have it like an interpreted perspective. So if I have the drums surrounding the listener, and then everything starts to happen around him, I don't really need to do a lot of dynamics with the drums because it stays there, and then it's the performance in that space that is enhanced. So if you look at the way I've panned the cymbals, for example, there are two cymbals that are panned up front and two that are panned a bit more back. One of the reasons for this is they're actually different micings and different recordings. So these are the ambient ones and these are the straight recordings. So having this a bit more back actually gives me a bit more space to blend in a lot of things, like the whole surrounding of the drums. One thing that I actually did in the drums is I have the drums also sent to a crush bus using a Fab Filter Saturn on the crush bus, followed by very heavy compression using the Pro compressor. Now, one thing that I really like about the Pro compressor is the fact that you have a parallel compression right there. And if you change your wet dry mix, you can choose to do that. But I decided to leave the Pro compressor to do its magic as it is, preceded by Fab Filter Saturn. I have the main drums with a bit of compression over there just to tame down some of the attacks and the release. Now, one of the techniques that I use a lot in my mixes is when we set times for the attack and release, we listen to it and we set a time in there. One of the things that I started using a few years back is to time the attack and release based on the tempo. So there's 11.5 and 115, which is, I think it comes to around 132nd and 164th based on a tempo of 130. So that's the tempo of the song. So it comes to roughly around this time. So the good thing about this is if the compressor pumps, it still pumps rhythmically. So you can go and compress a bit over the top and still not feel the compression because it starts to sound a bit more musical. I mean, yes, to the audiophile ears, you would hear the compression. There is no denying that fact. But the idea of this is not whether you're hearing compression or are you going to notice that fact. The idea behind this is how much of it is musical. The third thing I have is Phoenix Verb, which is again my most favorite small room reverb. Exponential Audio has actually two versions of a reverb. One is the Phoenix Verb and the other one is R2. So I am primarily a film mixer, and I've found that from my experience, musical reverbs don't really sound as good as a realistic reverb. You want to have a bit more sheen, a bit more lushness in a music reverb, whereas in your real world reverb, you want it to be a bit dirty. You can't have the tails die out so perfectly. They have to have a bit of grit and dirtiness in it. So in that sense, R2 is an amazing real world space, and Phoenix Verb is really, really good for musical reverbs. One pretty interesting thing that's there on the Phoenix Verb is if you look at this little T icon over here, if I click that, you can see there's something that's called a processing threshold. Right now it's set to 108. What that means is if the signal drops below minus 108 dB, this plugin leaves off the CPU. So you really have a very efficient way of working, especially if it's on an aux track, because Pro Tools, as it is, has got dynamic plugin processing, which works on audio tracks, as long as it's not in an input mode. What I've also done is I've added very high compression after the reverb because I want the reverb just to stay with the drums and not really have the tail. So I want the texture of Phoenix Verb to be there and avoid the whole length of the tail because there are other instruments that are going to come and cover that. So the most important factor for me is the LFE. If you've read any of my earlier blogs, I have spoken a bit about what a filter does in LFE and how it impacts the phase, especially because if you look at the way it's usually done, you have a kick track and you're sending this to LFE, right? And if you want to make your LFE clean, you would end up putting a filter on your LFE. So which means this track that is going to come in will phase cancel with the frequencies that you have on this because there's no other way that a filter can work. One of the things that I learned early on was to use a subharmonic enhancer or sometimes I would drop in a pitch shift or a slight reverb in the LFE before the filter. The reason is if it needs to cancel, it has to have coherent waveforms, or basically it has to have the exact waveforms present on the LFE channel and your main channel. What a subharmonic enhancer does is it generates additional frequencies from that, so thereby not leaving your main signal as it is or coherent with the signal on your main track, which means they won't cancel each other out even when you start summing them. The Pro subharmonic from Avid has been my favorite of late because of the way it generates those LFE and the way you have, in fact, you can also change the drive. You can have resonant drives over there, which is pretty good for something like thunders, or if you want to have like a very low, extended low from any one particular sound. So if you're doing dubstep or things like that, these are pretty good things to go with. And you can also choose your mix. So how much of it is it that you want to be generated and how much of it is it that you want to be real. So this is how the percussion tracks will sound like. So I have all of these routed to a drums bus that goes into the main bus. I also have a send to the crush bus, and some of them have a send that comes into my drum reverb. And all of this again is routed to something called a bed. Now, why do you need a bed? What is a bed? So if you look at the way Atmos works, Atmos, like I said earlier, is consisting of your beds and your objects. When I'm routing something to a bed, it actually goes into these channels over here. Now, if I want something to specifically move and access speakers over here, I mean, in a theater, you would have more speakers, right? Now, over here, it can go all the way up to 61 speakers and 3 LFE, so which makes it a total of 64. You can address each one of these speakers over there. Now, when I'm sending something to a bed over here, what I'm doing is, because I don't have what Dolby calls the RMU, I'm going to use a virtual RMU, which is called the local renderer. Or basically what it does is it does the whole function of the RMU within my system right here. So if you've seen the earlier routing over here, you can see that the main tracks are all routed to something that's called the bed 7.1. The bed 7.1 is just put into a blank track. The reason is, on this track, you would see something that's called a renderer input. What this does is, it takes in the signal that comes over here and sends it to this, because this is now functioning as a local RMU. Once this receives the signals, it will assign it properly to the right speakers and send it back through what is called the renderer output. Now, the renderer output has only got channel numbers. It doesn't have LCR, LS, RS, LF, etc. That's because it can go all the way from 9.1 to 11.1 to 13.1, etc., up to 16 outputs. So how it is set up is, the first one is left, the second one is right, the third one is center, the fourth one is LFE, LRC, LF, the left side's around, the right side's around, left back, right back, the left top, right top, and so on and so forth. So what I've done is, I've taken all of these over here back as an aux, and I've sent it to my monitoring chain. Now, the reason Dolby does this is because if I take this session right here, and if I take it to a mix stage that has Atmos within the system, all they need to do is, they don't really need to go through anything over here. Instead of sending this to the blank, they just need to assign this to their main object. So for example, the 7.1 would go to their bed output, and the object outputs would go directly to the MADI outputs. Which means at that point, all my pans that I've done earlier, which has got the object number 1 and 2, would come in here to object number 1 and 2. Now, if they route this to MADI number 11 and 12, because if you look at the I/O setup, the first 10 are going to be the bed, and then 11 and 12 will be object 1 and 2. So the next time I get this back, if I need to do an edit or if I need to do a correction, nothing changes, because this pan stays within the session, and it is just the outputs that is going to change. So which means session management from the mix stage to a laptop or to an edit room or anything like that is far, far simpler because you don't have to be concerned about automation going haywire or, losing outputs on a track or anything of that sort. So you can see all of this is routed to a bed, and in situations like this, I always use a VCA to mix. Now the reason is pretty simple. All of us come to an aux track over here. Now, if I lower the aux track and if the input is already pretty much loud, it doesn't make sense. I'm just lowering something that's already clipped. On the other hand, if I use a VCA to change things, you can see it changes the whole track status. So it kind of maintains a gain structure right there. And how you make a VCA is essentially you select all of the tracks that you want and you group them. So if you look over here, you can see it's grouped to a group A. And in this case, what I've done is I've only made it as a mix group. So if you look at the drums VCA, you can see it's a mix VCA. I've got all the percussions here and I've named it as a drums VCA, and it's assigned to the VCA channel called V drums. So I have my drum VCAs here, and the good thing is VCAs earlier used to be an HD only feature. As of now, it's also available in Pro Tools version from version 12, from the regular version of Pro Tools from version 12 onwards. Now that's my drum section. So going ahead, if you look at the bass, is played by a fantastic player called Vian Fernandez. So I really didn't want to do a lot of things with the bass from there because there's a very good tone and there's a very good way they've recorded things. All that I did was to add a bit of distortion to this so that it brings out a bit of grit to the bass as it is. So if I play this bass track over here, this is how it sounds like. And I also wanted to maintain his fingerings on the bass because that is one of the things that's going to cut through the song at that point. Again, like I was mentioning about the compression earlier, I have a compressor over here that is side changed with the kick. So for the bass, what I've done in this case, which is different from the way that I've done on the main mix, is I've put the Pro Subharmonic on the main 7.1 bus. Now that's another way you can use Pro Subharmonic. It can generate the LFE from your main channels, and you can choose exactly how much percentage of that main channel should contribute to the generated LFE. For example, you can have like 50% of the front and 100% of the center, and maybe nothing from the surrounds to go into your LFE, to generate the LFE content that is there. The advantage this in here is if I have a bit of width on the tracks, it would take the mix from the entire stage, or if I have it on surround, which I don't, but if I have it on surround, it would take it from this entire mix and then generate my additional low end on that. One of the things that I must admit, I've not done a lot of pure music mixes, and because pure music mixes is not my main strength, and it becomes very difficult for me to mix a stereo or mix a surround version without having a visual reference, because that's something that I've grown used to a lot. The reason I say that is when you have mono tracks like this and you start piling them up in the center, it's very important for you to realize how you are actually starting to create a mono mix right here. And for me, the biggest challenge for any mix engineer is actually to get the entire dynamics and depth from a mono mix rather than having all the facilities over here that it offers you. Once you get that right, and then you start opening things up, your mix A maintains a lot of consistency, but B, what it also helps you is it helps you tell the story, which is the most important thing in any mix. At the end of the day, you are trying to give your version of what is happening on screen, or what is the composer trying to tell you. Now, at that point, let's have a look at what's there on the distortion guitars. Now, the distortion guitars are actually layered, and the guitars are played by two fantastic guitarists. One is Mithun Raju, and the other is Ashok. Both prodigies in their own sense. Now, if you look at the guitars, there's not really much that I've done there, except I've used the guitar amp from Waves over there, and in fact these EQs were not mine. These were done by Amith and Rajan when it came to me. So it's not stuff that I've added on top of it. One of the things that's very important for me when I pan is, like I said, it's very important to understand the philosophy of a pan. So if you have guitars like this, what will you keep in the front and what will you keep in the surrounds? There are two ways of looking at this. Anything that has mids will be intimidating, because this is an example that I often give in my workshops is, if you hear a tiger growl in front of you versus a twig break behind you, which one is more intimidating? And most of the times I get the answer, it's a twig break. The reason is, when you hear that, you can't really pin it to one particular thing. You have to think about what it is, and your mind goes into an overload. And it is very comforting for us to hear sounds in front, but it's also very intimidating for us to hear sounds from the sides or behind, because your brain has to work into figuring out what it is. And that's I would assume that's an evolutionary concept. So what I kind of do in my mixes is to find out, do I need the intimidation at that point, or do I need to be surrounded by things? If I need to be filled around, washed away by sound, I try and bring the lower ends into the surrounds, the lower sections of that. If I want something to be more powerful, something that the audience needs to sit and look up, I would flip those roles around and I would start bringing the mid frequencies a bit to the surrounds. Now, there have been a lot of debates about, if you bring mids and higher frequencies to the surrounds, it starts slapping with your front and you have the delays and all of that. But there are different techniques of doing that. So what I've done in this case is, I have a guitar here, which I've panned to the front, and this is how it sounds like. I have another set of guitars, if you look at the pan, that's actually panned a little bit more in compared to what it was earlier. And this is how this particular guitar sounds like. So you can hear there's a bit more of a low end that is there. And I want all of those to be concentrated towards the front. And when it comes to something that I've kept a bit back, it's actually inside. Now, this is one space a lot of us should actually try out experimenting, because most of the times our pans are all to the walls. We have this idea of panning extremely end to the end of the walls. Sometimes if you start panning things around, it glues the mix much faster. And this is my pan for this guitar over here. So you can hear a bit of the grit and the dirt in that guitar, which for me is a bit more intimidating than the ones that you heard right in front. So when you bring this back, you are more closer to this particular guitar than you are to the ones in front. So if I play these three tracks, this is how they sound in unison. So you can hear that the moment it enters this space, there's a lot of interaction that is happening over there, which is pretty automatic, But it's not after doing a lot of things from my side as a mixer, but it's because of the way it's played. They kind of turn around and play with each other in that 2D space that you're creating around that. On the masters, again, over here, I'm using an R2 because I don't want these guitars to sound musically lush or musically that clean. Like I said, we've used the guitar amps, we've used a lot of grit in this. So I want them to sound real world and a bit dirty. So that's the guitars. Now, again, then we have the acoustic guitars over here. The acoustic guitars, again, the Echo Boy is something that I added because I wanted to give a sense of a different space to it. So what I've done is I've basically taken these two tracks. The original was just these two tracks of guitar. I've taken these two tracks and I've duplicated them. What I've done is I've added, so this track is the same as this, but this one has a delay to it. Again, this track is the same as this one has a delay to it. What I've done is I've panned this delayed track. So if this is the main track, and you can see the pan here, I've panned the delay track to the opposite side of this. So what that gives me is more like an artificial sense of depth. So if you have your main signal here and a slap from here, you would instantly be put into a different space. It's the same thing with this guitar. I've taken this one and I've panned it to the other opposite side, as you can see over here. So what is happening is you have different pans on these ends, and you have the main tracks over here giving you a very indistinguishable sense of space. Although it sounds like that, the moment I play this track, you will instantly hear the whole coloration that this track adds to it. So if I just take those and solo that, so you can hear the difference that's being brought up in that. There's nothing really special that's happening that I've done in this. There's a bit of distortion that I've added from the 11 rack plugin sets in the acoustic guitar, just so that it cuts through a certain portion over here, and this is how it sounds like. And this being panned in the center will actually give you the whole space of the entire guitar functioning as one unit. Now, that's very important because you need instruments or sections of instruments to function as one unit, and then in the end they all blend together to give you that one whole song. Because there's no point if the drummer stands out, if the vocalist stands out, if it's an excellent guitar, if there's a good strumming in there, there's no point in that if it doesn't work with the whole song. If you listen to this one portion, it's actually a pretty interesting portion over here. You can hear a lot of playfulness in this track that is there. And I must tell you, this playfulness is a complete contradiction to what the lyrics are saying, and that's actually done on purpose by Govind. That's actually one of his ways of composing, where he adds in a lot of contradictions to the main melody that is happening there. The next one is again some processed guitars. Again, nothing too fancy in that. Most of the things that happens in this, I would explain it during when I'm showing you the mix process. And the piano section is played by an amazing piano player called Ruthin Tej. He is the youngest in that band, and he's again a very good piano player. If you look at the way the piano is set up in this, it's mostly just playing the same set of chords over and over again. So it's not something that varies a lot. So for me to have the piano come in and go and make the listener aware of something that's happening around him, or when you see a shot of Ruthin, for it to come in and go, so that then the piano sticks with you. It's very important that I ride the pianos a bit. And again, for me, I tend not to leave a lot of things very static, because if I leave them static, they just fade away from your mind. They're like a blind spot that's there. Any slight movement either in pan or in levels or in EQ would immediately bring that to your attention without having to do it a lot. For the pianos, I've used Equilibrium from DMG Audio, which is again one of my favorite stuff for music, because you actually have the EQs based on the notes that's there, which I like a lot actually. So this is the piano section that I have over here, followed by the process tracks. Now, like I said, the process tracks consists of some pads and some of the effects that is there. Here, I've done a very interesting thing. So this plugin that you see is called the multi-band splitter, and it comes from the Pro series of plugins of Avid. This little plugin functions in a very unique way. So what I've done is I've taken this pad that you see here and I've sent it to an aux, right? If you see, there is no output on the aux because I don't need an output. So this goes through a track called process send, and it comes to this track's input as process send. On this aux, I've inserted the multi-band splitter. So if you look at the multi-band splitter, you can see it's dividing that whole signal into 4 bands, right? So you have the lows, the low mids, the high mids, and the highs. What it does after this is the most brilliant part of this. For each channel, you can actually get the input of each one of this band. So what I've done is I've created 4 stereo auxes. You can see it's called low, low mid, mid, and high. On the low, I would have the low band. On the mid, low mids, I would have the low mids, and etc. etc. So I've basically taken each one of this band into each one of this auxes over here. Now, why did I do that? Here's why. The low section of the pads are panned towards the front. The low mids are brought a little bit back, but what I've also done on the low mids is to add a bit of reverb to this. The idea behind this is when you go towards the lower notes on the pads or the holding notes, you can have them stretch out, and kind of you have the washed out feeling that I was talking about a bit earlier. I have the mids that I kept right in front because they're the ones that give you the main notes of the pads. Now I've gone one step ahead, and on the highs over here, if you see what I've done is I've panned the highs a bit back, and what I've also done is I've added echo bar as a delay. So when you have, like, let's say a higher synth or a higher bell-like tone that is present in the pad over here, I have the lows coming out in the front, I have the low mids spreading out, I have the mids giving you the main content from right in the front, and I have a bit of delays and a bit of extra spread and extra space that I can get from the high frequencies. This thing was very, very difficult to achieve before this, because before this you would have to split this into 4 auxes, put different band pass filters on each auxes, and then follow this. And honestly, I didn't have that idea before this came along. So this is how the pad sounds like once we have this. Now I want you to look at the surround meters over here to see how it spreads out. So you can hear the highs being delayed over there. That's the main mid frequency. This is the low mids with the reverbs. There's not a lot of lows in this below that given frequency range. So things like this actually helps you in a surround mix to spread something that is already stereo. Rather than upmixing it, you can have a lot more creative freedom in creating a different set of different soundscape when it comes to surround. So this is how this little pad sounds like. And the reason I wanted to do this was because when this plays, there's a lot of other parallel elements that play along with it, and I wanted each one of this to remain in its space. And like I showed you earlier, I've used the inside space for the reverbed low mid, and whereas for the extreme highs, I wanted to be spread out a bit more wider so that you have the hits alternating between your ears at that point. Another thing that I've done over here on the vocals is to use stutter. So basically, this is a scream that comes in over here, and when you look at the visual of the scream, there is another alternating representation that happens on screen right here. So if I play this section, so what is actually being shown on screen is the fact that now, according to tradition, when someone dies, you have people come in there. There is a lot of rituals that are done for the person. Now, this is the point at which the person is realizing that he's dead, So if you look at the expression over here, he's realizing that he's dead and he's surrounded by people who've come to mourn for him. But he isn't sure of the point, like, are they really mourning for him or are they mourning for the departed soul? Now, this is my interpretation of what it is, and I haven't spoken. So, by the way, this is Govind, who's again the lead person for this. So, this scream for me represents the tearing apart of the soul from the main body. So, what I've done is I've had the main scream right here sent up front, and the stutter, what it does is, because it stutters out, it gives you a bit of dissociation from the main ones over there, and it's spanned a bit towards the back, so that when the stutter comes in, you can actually have a look at the volume representation over here. The stutter actually fades in to the main track and then kind of rides in between and fades out. So it creates a whole chaos and confusion of, is the soul actually torn apart, or has he understood that he's dead and the soul is split, or who is he mourning for? So all of these things come in one go at that one point with just this one little trick. And that's why the stuttered thing was panned towards the back, so that it's away from the listener. It's somewhere on the back of their heads, whereas the main screams are panned towards the front, so that is the one that is in focus, with this just coming in and drifting in and out, somewhere behind you. Now, coming to chorus, most of these things that you see were already done by them, and I haven't added anything special in this except for this one plugin. This is Spanner from the Cargo Cult. Again, it is one of my favorite plugins, in which I use a lot in my mixes, and I'll also show you some of the techniques that I use in this particular mix. Now, in this particular situation, one of the reasons I decided to use Spanner is, now, when they start the chorus, what you can see is, you can see a slight headbang that is going to happen. So you see this headbang. Now, I want this motion to be there within the chorus. Now, the whole idea behind that is, at this point, there's the entire music that is static, and you want to stay focused to the whole motion that is happening with the singers there. If you look at the expressions that they're having very, very real and much more pained expressions right there. You can see the whole pain that is coming out of the way they're singing it, and it's actually a cry out loud to the person, as in, like, are you realizing in a society where you live, no one really knows if you're alive or dead, and no one really knows the truth. And this whole sway is something that I wanted in this. Now, the way I've panned this is, so I have one vocal track that's panned a bit off to the left, the second vocal track, the same one, off to the right. I have the third one that's panned, you could say, angled towards the right, and then the other one is angled towards the left, and there's one that should be towards the back. Yes, so this one is set towards the back. The only challenge in this is, this particular track that's been angled towards the left is also the track for the main singer, for him. So when I have his track come in front on screen, I shift the pan so that it comes right in front to the screen, and then goes off to be blended along with the score. And all of these tracks are sent to a chorus bus that is again sent to the bed, and this chorus bus has Spanner inserted on it. So at this point, if I play this track, you can actually hear how the whole movement happens within that chorus, and how it kind of syncs well with the action, with what is happening on screen.
வாழாம் பாடம் கொய்யும் குடியோன் கலி கொண்டே வாளூரி சென்னே பிராகாய் முள்ளாய் ஊரா குடுக்கில் பெற்றம்மே நீயும் பிடங்கே.
So over here, when you come to this one particular track of him singing on an individual scene, what I've done is, I've raised the mids as you reach there, so that you have a bit more focus to him. Now, if you hear this, you instantly connect to his vocal right there. So until that point, you have the whole chorus singing, you focus to one person, you have the whole chorus singing, and it has to happen seamlessly. Actually, three ways of doing this: bands, levels, and EQ. So the techniques that I've done here is actually a combination of all three. The levels over here is done with clip gain. There's an EQ change that is happening over here. As you can see, the mids kind of come up. And when it comes to the pan, it goes, if you look at the pan tracks over here, he goes from being in the side over here to coming back to the front. This approach would not have been possible if there was no visual reference. In fact, it would have sounded really, really bad without a visual reference. But when you have a visual reference, your whole mind is going to be stuck with what is happening on screen. You want to stay with the story on screen and let the sound surround you or take you through the story. So for the vocals, now there's a few things that I did on the vocals. The main vocals is sung by Peethambaran uncle, who's the character that you see right here. So he's also Govind's dad. There were two things that were done to this vocal. Govind sang the scratch track for this, and over which his father sang this. Now, Govind's voice is young, he has got a lot of grit, and he has a different color and texture to his voice. His father's voice, on the other hand, is very, very mature, but it does not have the grit that Govind's voice would impart to it. So what we did was we took Govind's voice, we took his dad's voice, and we used Revoice Pro to kind of match performance on both of this. And with a bit of editing, I do not have the original tracks here, but you can hear that in this there are certain words that start, there's a bit of grit that has come in his voice, and that is all taken from Govind's performance. Now, when you think of performance, what it actually is mostly how you pronounce the T's and the P's and the S's, and what pitch do they come in. Do you have a break before the P's and the T's, and do you have the break before your start words? So all of this impacts a lot of power to the voice, and this is exactly this. I think this is what Revoice does. To this, what he's added, he's added a lower level of voice over here, which is lower in pitch. Now, one of the things the things that I did with this portion, which was not done in the original mix that you would hear, is as you go further down the song, the person. So you have the real person, and I would take this as being, the soul part of it. So you have the real person and you have the soul. Now, as you go further along the song, there is a realization at the end that nothing ever ends. So it's like saying, you cannot kill a soul, or it continues on in another journey. So what I've done in this case is, now, of course, that does sound a lot of philosophical, and initially it may sound like I'm bullshitting a lot, but that's honestly not the fact. The fact here is, I wanted these two to have a different balance as it reaches this portion here. What that gives me is the ability to start from someone who's really weak. If you see his on-screen presence, from someone who's really weak in a daze to someone who's realizing what he is and how he has reached where he is. So if you look at the levels, these levels actually gradually drop down compared to what you have on the main levels, and that has been done on purpose so that you have a different power that comes to your voice by the time you reach the end. One of the things that I have done on this with the reverbs is something that I don't usually do, but what I've done is, again, I'm using my favorite reverb over here, Phoenix Verb. It's got a very, very long reverb tail. It's around 15 seconds over here. And what I've done is I have a compressor on the reverb track with a side chain from the vocals. So the idea behind this is, when the vocals happen, the reverb is actually compressed. And the reverb opens up between the lines and at the end of the line. So which means I can have a really, really long tail to go in between all of the instruments that is there to give them the space, and still have the main vocal over there, because this reverb would be ducked when this vocal comes in. So if I play this in solo, you can actually hear the duck that is happening.
പാഞ്ഞേ മുന്നേ ആരാൻ പോണേ തീയാട്ടാൻ കോമരം പിൻപേ ഞാനേ.
So you can hear the reverb coming up over here. Now, the interesting thing, or a kind of a designy thing that I did in this one, was to add a pitch shift on the reverb, and it's been pitched not an octave down. It's been pitched a few notes down. The reason I did that is because I wanted the reverb to be a bit of his voice, and also to add a different character for the reverb itself. Like I said, the more you go towards the end, he realizes what his path is. So this pitch that stays in the lower octave adds a lot of lower end and kind of a growl to his whole reverb. But the mix percentage of this pitch is set to around 26%, which is around 1/4 of the main track, or the main tone that is there, main pitch. What I've done in the very end, as he stops his line, I've brought the mix completely back to 100. So which means it changes from being the original pitch of the reverb to something that goes down and fades into darkness, which is again unknown, and it comes back to a very low, to a slightly lower octave, and this is how it sounds like.
Chathe.
So you can hear the transition happening at this point over here, where it actually becomes very dark. And again, honestly speaking, without the visual, this reverb, I don't know if it would have made a lot of sense, in that space. Vocal effects. Now, I happen to call this vocal effects, but there are also quite a few other effects that are placed in this. Now, over here, you would see I have taken one particular track and made it into an object. The reason is, this track and the place where this track appears is actually in this particular scene. And if I play the scene without the sound, you can see there's a lot of intercuts, and there's a lot of different places where he actually looks at. So you can see he looks at a lot of different places. Now what I've done is I've taken this. So this was how it would have, the original track was, what I did was I took this, I set my grid to 1/8 on the grid, and I've gone to edit separate clip on grid. What that gives me is, it gives me these cuts that are exactly on 1/8 of every bar. The next thing is to select each and every one from where the visual starts. So it starts right around here. So according to where he looks, there's a different pan that is applied to all of this. So I've been following his eyes and not his face. So his face may be looking somewhere else, but his eyes look somewhere else. And once I've done that, I smoothen out these pans. Now, I've also duplicated this track over here because, a lot of these pans, what they have a tendency of jumping around. And when it jumps around, you don't want to pull the person listening to this to be very conscious of the fact that there is audio that is jumping around. Instead, you want to be stuck to the visual right there. And so if I were to just play this one track without the support track, this is how it sounds like. So you can hear all the jumps that is happening right there. So when I have the support track along with it, it doesn't sound as hard as it is. So at this point, you have this particular track acting as the glue to this track's movements. But you want the movements also to be a bit prominent, because when this becomes a bigger size, the movement of this Atmos object makes a lot of sense. So you can see that. So again, it's very important for you to realize, this is something that I've realized over time, is that if I mix to a big screen, there's a lot of difference that happens to the way I pan compared to the way if I mix onto a section of video. Another thing is also, if you look at this, this is the Atmos panel that you have. So I have different ways of linking this. It works pretty much similar to the Pro Tools panel. So if it's mirrored, what would happen is they would be in opposite directions, and if it's linked or if it's copied, it's essentially like linking them. So you have, this is how it happens at copy. Now you have different modes over here. So if I use the triangle mode over here, what that does is it takes it from the front directly overhead and back. So now if you look at this over here, you can see the way it pans. It goes from the bottom directly overhead and to the back. Now if we use this on a curve visual, this is how it looks like. So it goes like a curve. So if I keep it onto the side, you could probably see it a bit. It goes like a curve. It goes like a dome. So on this one, it would be like a triangle. It goes straight up and straight down. And on this one, once it crosses halfway, it stays up and would just stay there. And comes back. So this mode is again something that's very useful when doing Atmos mixes, because the other way would be you do your pan and then you do another pan for the Z space, which is a bit not too comfortable when you want to pan things around. This little button over here is called a speaker snap. So basically what that does is, if I have this sound, let's say I bring this down to 0. If I keep this over here and if I engage speaker snap, this sound would snap to the speaker that's closest at this position and would only play back from that one speaker. So that's what speaker snap does. And then you have size, which is pretty much like divergence. If I take that off, just like divergence when it comes to the same Pro Tools panel. So if I keep this panel here, and if I have the Pro Tools panel here, this X axis that you see here is the same as the front axis that you see here. The Y axis that you see here is the same as the front rear axis that you see here. There is no Z axis, and the size that you see here is the same as divergence that you see on these things. So you can see it's pretty similar to having to the Pro Tools panel. And what any immersive format gives you and the way it changes compared to a conventional mix is just this one thing. It is just a different set of tools to pan. Nothing else changes from the way you mix. There's a bit of discipline involved in the way you set up your tracks, yes, but apart from that, there's really nothing that changes from the way you mix. And this is how it really is quite simple when it comes to Dolby Atmos. And it's just one little thing that you need to see here. And I was talking about the way you assign the object numbers. If you click this little icon over here, you can actually choose which object is this going to go to. And this is going to object 1, 2, which I showed you earlier over here. So it comes to these two tracks, which is object 1, 2, that goes to my renderer, which you can see this is object 1 and this is object 2. So this will go to the renderer, which is this little application. This will send it back over here through these. So this is called a renderer input because it inputs to the renderer, and this is called the renderer output from which it receives this. So I basically get a mix down right then and there, using this set of auxes right here. What I want to talk about the next is the way I've handled the mix and the way I look at mix as a philosophy over here. So this is my entire session. The way I've laid it out. So I have my VCAs on top, followed by, so the exact order in which the VCAs are, I would have my source tracks at the bottom, followed by the guitars and the voices, and followed the bass, the guitars, the acoustic guitars, the pads, the pianos, the effects that we just spoke about, the voice, the chorus, and all of that. Now, if without a visual reference, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. One of the things that I noticed when I first saw the visual is, let's say I play this particular track without the audio. You can see there's a lot of solitude to the way he is. You can see the way the shots are actually, they're very slow. There's a lot of distance imparted in that. The tracks are very slow, and you feel a lot of solitude in this. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do here was to stay with the character. I didn't want things to be outside of the space that he is in. And so the technique that I used here was to have this particular section in mono until, so ritually when this happens, when he steps into the water, that is the first step that you do in a ritual um, for the dead person. And over here, that is when I wanted to open up into the whole space of the conflict. So what I did here was I took this entire mix. Now I didn't want to pan and repan everything that was happening over there. So on my main bus, what I did was I added spanner, and like I said, these are things that you could not have done without this plugin. So what I did was I added spanner and I let the mix start from the center, opening up slowly as you come into this whole section until the point that he's realized the fact. So that was the first thing that I did. The second thing that I did was I wanted the audience to start off with a very with a slightly narrower bandwidth, so that it's a bit more mellow and you don't want to get in the aggression beforehand with all the brighter sounds over there. So what I did was I added an EQ over here, and what the EQ does is it goes from having a high pass and a low pass, so it goes from there, and as the pan opens up, so does the EQ open up. So it opens up exactly the way the pan does. So when the whole mix is spreading out across the whole area, giving you the opening up of the soundscape, so does the frequency part of it. In that sense, what happens is it opens up, and then you have a whole lot of expressions, not only in terms of space but also in terms of tonality. And this is how that portion, that whole section sounds like.
പാഞ്ഞേ മുന്നേ ആരാൻ പോണേ തീയാട്ടാൻ കോമരം പിൻപേ ഞാനേ തന്നെ കണ്ടാരങ്കാവേൽ ചേരുന്നേ കണ്ണീരിക്കൊണ്ടേ.
So you can see it makes a whole lot of sense with having those long timed delays even when it's mono. Now at the point where it opens up, this is how it sounds like.
വായ്ക്കരിതന്നേ ചൊല്ലുന്നേ ഞാൻ പണ്ടേ ഛത്തേ.
Right. Over there, what I've also done is I've also done a small ride on the distortion guitar, so that you have the vocals come in and you have the guitars underneath that. And during the morph, or during the slight tearing that I was talking about earlier on the vocal tracks right here, where you have the dip in the tear vocals over there, which, if you remember, is this little thing, or which is the stutter vocal thing. At that point, what I've done is I've raised the guitars a bit so that you have a different melody come in. And the way these guitars are panned, these are the distortion guitars, the way these distortion guitars are panned, if you remember, has the more intimidating parts towards the sides of your ears and the more melody part towards the front. So it starts to build that space right there. And at this point, if you remember, I had mentioned that the kick is really, really compressed and you have very little space for it. That's also because you have the bass notes come out much more cleaner over there. Once once you cross that, the next portion that comes in over here, like after break, is a different set of vocals. At this point, the person has realized that he's dead and he's starting to do the rituals for himself. So this is what happens, what I've done to the vocals over there, with a slight change in the acoustic guitars, because the acoustic guitars play a bit of a contradictory chords to what is actually being said on screen, and this is how it sounds like. So you understand, you can hear the contradiction of the way the chords progress compared to what is actually being depicted with lyrics. I wanted to bring this contradiction out front because, from what I understand, that itself is a conflict of emotions between what is happening in reality and what the person has experienced. So I've bought these guitars a bit upfront because the lyrics will anyways be in your head because it's spoken word and you kind of make out through the words of what is happening there. But these things bring out a different emotion. And because you understand the lyrics as something that is very graphic and the chords that are playing as something that's very contradictory to the person who's listening, and the person who's watching would have the emotional impact of this character that is there. So if I play that again, this is how it sounds like.
മന്ദായി മാറുന്നേ മാവായി പൂഴുന്നേ എല്ലെല്ലാം നീറി പൊടിഞ്ഞേ പിണ്ടമീരുത്തിട്ട്.
So this person over here is Mithun Raju, who's played the lead guitars on this. Now, one of the things that I've done with the guitars over here is, as you see the leads on screen, there is a different ride that happens to it. So if you look at this track actually has a lot of left-right pans that is happening within it. But what I've done is I've kept it in the front so that when you see him play, you actually connect with that person, and when you cut off from that scene, it becomes part of the music score. And this is how it sounds like in solo. So you can see that once you've disconnected, once you've gone away from the shot of him playing the guitar, it becomes part of the space. Again, this is a very easy technique to link this guitar to the fact that he's playing it right then and there, right in front of you, and it's actually a performance. And at the other cut, once you cross this, it is part of the story. So you have to get your instruments to be part of the person right in front of you and part of the story. And this is a pretty easy way of achieving it. And in context, this is how it sounds like. Over here, you have two very distinct screams that happen. So this person you're seeing right here is Piyush, who's the amazing person who does the first scream, and there's another person who screams just behind him. This is Anish, who's again not the drummer Anish. This is again another vocalist Anish, who does this fantastic second growl that comes in. Now, this piece over here transitions from the face of the crow all the way to Piyush, to this very extravagant dance form which we call Theyyam in our place. Now, what I've done is I've taken the main track. There's also an additional process track that is panned towards the surrounds. So you can see the way this blends in as you go in from what is on screen as the crow. The crow has a very symbolic representation of a bird that is present during the last rituals of the dying person. So it comes from there, goes into the person on screen, and then comes back out, dispersed into the space. But at this point, you also have Anish's vocals that come in as a very guttural growl. And in the whole space of pans, this is how this whole section sounds like. If you've been following my interpretations that I've been trying to achieve, you will see exactly how this is done. So you have Anish's vocal that come in and go off to the other side. So the idea behind this is, at this point he starts off on, if you look at the pan window over here, he starts off on the right side, comes here, is on screen, but he's also in this entire space, and then he moves away from that space towards the side again. Again, like I said, it is very important to understand that this is the very important reason that a stereo mix with visual will sound very different the moment you start playing all of these balances into the mix, because you have a visual hook that you plan, that you have to support. Over here, what's also happening is you have a shot of the drummer coming in with his double kick and his snare that he's actually hitting quite hard. Along with that, you also have the lead guitars that are being played over there. So one of the things over here is, like I said, once we have the balance of the rhythm that is set, the easiest way for me to hook things to the screen is, if you see the drummer on screen, there is just a very slight increase to the snares that he's hitting over there, a very slight increase to the hi-hats that he's hitting over there, and we also want to maintain the lead that is happening over there, because you want to hear what is happening over there. And for the leads, what I've actually done is, instead of keeping it in center, which is what we've always expected, it opens up into the surrounds over time, so that you have space for something that is coming after this lead over here. So you have this lead that starts from the front, goes to the surround, and is taken over by the second lead, which has a visual representation over here. And this second lead is placed right in the front. So this track opens up for space, and that space is filled by this lead. So if I play this section, this is how it sounds like. Right. So one of the little things that I've done here is also to increase the guitars. As you see his fingers moving across here, is also to bring a sense of hook of the audience watching it to that particular performance, because as I understand, that's a very complex piece of music to be played. Now, in isolation without the visual, this sounds very bad. With the visual, and if I make it full screen and if I play, you can see the connection with what is happening on screen. So with the visual, you can see that it's practically impossible to detect these little rises that happen, because it also ties you down to what's happening on screen. Now here again, we come to the chorus part, which I explained earlier about the whole head swaying and how I wanted the pans to move along with that, which I did using spanner. You see Rutin playing his guitars right up in front over here. Again, it's the same technique that I've used earlier for the drums. I have a ride on the pianos that happen right there. So you can see the pianos, they rise up, and then you have a different balance of the pianos, because at that point of time, you want to blend in the pianos into the whole performance, because now that you've seen him in a particular emotional state, and you've seen the character or the performer right there in front of your screen. Once all of this is done, there is a small gap right here. This gap over here for me is the serene point, where that is the crossover of realization of the point that I am the soul and I have another journey to continue. So what I've done here is the vocals at this point, so everything dies off. This is how Govind has composed it. The vocals over here have their own long reverbs that stay there. And when he starts off on his journey, I wanted the vocal to cut through everything without lowering anything else. So you have the lead vocals that start up a bit upfront, and at that point, because he's starting on a new journey, you never know what the new journey is, and you don't want, there is the space for everything has to happen naturally without ducking or creating a space for it. Which is why I wanted the guitars, the drums, the bass, the pads, everything to be upfront and still be able to hear the vocals cut through it. So that's what I managed to achieve over here. And then at the end of it over here, you have the entire journey being summed up in his visual space, coming back to a rebirth, saying, it starts again. Now, one little thing that I did, which is also one of the last things that I would want to show you over here, is I have the decapitator on the master bed track. And what I've done is I've automated the mix value on this. The reason is there are certain shots in this that are pretty much like a stutter or like a blown out thing. So if you see, there are certain shots that come up like this, they tear out. So I wanted those shots. So if even this one particular shot, if you look at it, the way it changes between what is here and what is here. Now I wanted to highlight those shots, and one of the things that, if you look for me, for the color is like it's very it's very driven. It's like we have an overdrive on our tracks, and that's exactly what I did with the decapitator. So I've put this on a very high drive and on punish, and I've changed the mix levels of this particular plugin on exactly those shots when it happens on screen. So if I play back this, now you can see the automation levels over here. If I play back this, you can see how the sound kind of changes just for those shots right there. Now, again, this is another thing that would have made no sense absolutely if it was just a stereo mix. The whole reason this works is because you have a visual that it is representing and it has to tie to. So this is basically the deconstruction of Thaikkudam Bridge Chathe in surround in Dolby Atmos, mixed down to stereo, showing you a whole workflow and my philosophy to how I approach a mix. And what I'll do at this point is I'll play the whole song so you can have a listen to it, and you can also find the song on YouTube. You can find the other songs of Thaikkudam Bridge on YouTube in the links that I will be posting on my blog. And so this is it. Thank you guys for watching. Here's the song.
ആരാൻ പോണേ തീയാട്ടാൻ കോമരം പിൻപേ ഞാനേ തന്നെ കണ്ടാരങ്കാവേൽ ചേരുന്നേ കണ്ണീരിക്കൊണ്ടേ പൊള്ളും മുന്നേ കരിന്തിരി കണ്ടേ നോവിൻ വായ്ത്താരി കേട്ടേ ഉൾക്കൈയിൽ കാലൻ വായ്ക്കരിതന്നേ ചൊല്ലുന്നേ ഞാൻ പണ്ടേ ഛത്തേ നരച്ചീറും തെണ്ടാൻ നാൾ നോക്കി തന്നേ ഏവും ചങ്കും തോലേൽ പൊള്ളും നീ പുണ്ണും നീ നക്കി തിന്നേ വിട്ട് ഗാവീന്നൊഴിച്ചിട്ട് നാട്ടാർ പൂവി ഞാൻ ചത്തേ. കൗബീനമെറിഞ്ഞിട്ട് തേയായി തുള്ളുന്നു പണ്ടേ വെട്ടി മുറിച്ച്